This one is going to require a little bit of a backstory to get. I'm not going to give the full context because that kind of spoils it, but so this is a short story, sort of. It's technically a novel chapter, but like from a novel that is just a collection of short stories using the same characters and style.
And it's a short story within that series of short stories.
Right, it's like an aside or a flashback or something. So, this thing that I'm referring to, basically, like 7 years ago when we were just starting out in high school, I read this thing on the internet about some guys that got together and wrote a book by just, like, agreeing on what the character's name was and what genre they were writing, and then everybody just wrote their own thing and somebody stitched it together later. So we were like, hey, we're fucking 15 and bored and psychotic, we can do something like that, right? I tried to get some people to join in on that with us, but I had like 3 people that I asked. One of them just immediately told me, yeah, I want to say that I'm gonna do that, but no. So that went nowhere. Somebody else said they were going to write something, but then didn't really turn in anything we could use. The third person wrote a single chapter and invented a character that we're going to keep, but we didn't get much of anything else out of that. That was about it.
Hey,
so then
somebody else gave us the line, "He poops" on a piece of paper.
Yep.
And that was it. That was their contribution.
Yeah, we asked one of our friends to write a chapter for the story. They wrote down the word "he poops" in the middle of a blank sheet of paper with nothing else on it in normal font writing, and then just gave that back to us. It took them like a week to write it, too. But then, yeah, like, that's just where this came from. The book itself, in terms of its style, you're gonna see that in a little bit, but like, the closest we've been able to get to describing what this book is have been things like, it's poetically stupid with a dash of cinnamon, or it's like trying to take a sudden U-turn even though you're in a submarine in the middle of the desert. It's a weird one. So, yeah, like I said, I'll explain the whole context of this chapter when we get done with it, because it kind of changes the meaning of it. It's actually pretty funny, but then, that about does it for that. So, I'm just gonna read into this one now. This is, the chapter, The Baseball Player. Cornelius was not much more than a boy that summer. He had once again just barely escaped with his life from the screaming pit of nonsense and despair that those on the inside referred to as worse than Adolf Hitler Middle School, but everybody else simply called Adolf Hitler Middle School, mostly because that was the name of the school. The school was always quick to explain they were named after a different Adolf Hitler, explaining the portraits of their founder as a Charlie Chaplin fan, the school's emblem as a Buddhist good luck symbol, and the school colors of red and black as being an unfortunate coincidence. Cornelius had earned himself a 3-month period of respite for his troubles, time which he mostly wasted by watching cartoons or committing random acts of petty mischief. He knew that this freedom could not last for very long, yet he still couldn't be bothered to make the most of it, content to squander away his time with pointless nothings and trivial obscenities. Cornelius did eventually tire of his routines, and searching for some sense of novelty, he decided to throw himself from the immaculate comfort of his home to the uncaring, unfeeling vastness of the universe outside, or at the very least, to the sidewalk in front of his house. Though the sun had spent much of its energy and was preparing to bed for the night, Cornelius was still stuffed full of the energetic, passionate retardation that is inherent to most 13-year-old males. In spite of this, for some reason, he paused for a moment before he threw open the wooden portal that promised a twilight world of wonder and contentedness. He gazed through the half-open window, nearly pulled back into the house by some subtle magnetism he couldn't quite place, and so he ignored it completely. Amidst the oblivious sea of life and wonder that swirled about the neighborhood, something was out of place. Nothing major, certainly, but he had the feeling that something vague was trying to distract him from his euphoric childhood stupor. Cornelius figured he must have been imagining things, and decided to disregard this intuitive warning and romp about the blinding lights and screaming noise of heavy traffic. By the next day, Cornelius had completely forgotten the previous evening, having pushed the unease out of his mind by rehearsing dirty limericks, writing duck jokes, and watching some bizarre German animated movie he couldn't pronounce the name of, in which a washed-up former superhero becomes the host of a cooking show after his retirement, and eventually reconnects with the members of his old superhero team while trapped in a collapsed elevator with them, until eventually, after 2 weeks of desperate cannibalism and psychotic meltdowns, the main character bleeds to death while trying to eat himself, dying alone as the credits roll over his partially chewed corpse. Even though the plot mostly went over his head, he at least thought the movie was pretty funny for the most part, except for the boring parts at the beginning. Naturally, with such a wealth of quality entertainment, Cornelius had tired himself quite nicely of the part of the world not inside his house, and would likely be content to seal himself inside a nest of old candy bar wrappers, gallons of root beer, and very poorly translated Japanese video games for the next 6 weeks. As he stuffed himself full of the most sugar-dense candies, snack cakes, and carbonated beverages he could find without going to the local black market. His member's card had expired, and he didn't feel very much like renewing it. He allowed his consciousness to slowly bleed out of his body, blending into the very fabric of the universe. It was evening when he finally returned to the world of the living from his castle of dreams and stupidity. His peaceful, sugar-induced coma had been painfully interrupted by a barrage of constant, ill-deserved laughter with the power to rot away one's faith in humanity, a sound that could only come from the most heinous of sources. An episode of The Big Bang Theory was playing on his TV. Still groggy and only technically conscious, he instinctively fled from the dark, terrible place his bedroom had become. A vile, intolerable wasteland that struggled in vain to bury ignorant hatred and borderline psychotic stupidity far beyond the limits of human comprehension, underneath several metric tons of ear-shredding, hyena-esque cackling presented before unremarkable circumstances, routine small talk, the various neuroses of a mentally ill sociopath, actors desperately shouting references to various movies and comics, as though doing so may finally cast off the shackles of the dark puppet master pulling their strings from off stage, and more than one homophobic rant apparently written by a deeply troubled, mentally handicapped 12-year-old. The juxtaposition of these many crimes with various other transgressions far too numerous to recount has left an irreparable stain on the very foundation upon which humanity was built, and Cornelius would not stand it for even a moment longer. In his irrational flight, without regard for his direction, only knowing to move as far away from the television as possible, he found himself once again staring out the window on the front door of his house. That confusing, almost dreadful feeling had brought itself upon him once more, though his feeble, childish mind could not grasp the meaning of his apprehension. At first, Cornelius thought he may have still been dreaming. Gradually, his wits came back to him, though his eyesight was not nearly so swift in its return. Still, he believed that he must have been hallucinating in the darkening dusk, though he only saw it for a moment, and he thought he must have simply caught a glimpse of something innocuous, and the irrational paranoia of being roused from such a deep slumber with such an incredible amount of sugar pulsing through his body must have been taking a toll on his mind. He likely believed that this was the case because it was not yet in his nature to believe in such monsters. Cornelius made an extensive effort to divorce himself from that feeling of dread in the following days. He had quite handily convinced himself that his fear on that night was completely unjustified. Not another comparable moment had occurred in those few days, and though it is debatable as to whether this calm came about of its own accord or as a result of Cornelius mercilessly pursuing it, he enjoyed it nonetheless. Naturally, he took this brief span of tranquility for granted, as he did most things, and like most other things, he assumed that he would barely miss it once he lost it. It could quite easily be argued that no human being has ever been more wrong about anything. During a particularly slow afternoon, after the rest of the world had filed off to toil away at work, Cornelius had assumed his carefree summer attitude yet again, and he gleefully intended to destroy his body with various unholy combinations of food and comedically ill-fitting condiments. On his route to the kitchen, however, another fateful glance towards the window would prove to be troublesome for him. In the empty daylight, there was not another soul around, or at least not another soul that had any earthly business being there. There could be no denial this time. Cornelius was suitably rested, and the world provided ample lighting. Denial could do him no good, as he stared without relent into the very eyes of horror. Cornelius had seen monsters before, but none like this. This was a wholly different breed from the average everyday monster. Everybody knows the type. The kind of monster made of a human torso with an enormous vertical mouth that cleaves it in half, with a pair of human heads attached at each shoulder, and a large hairy leg stretching up from where its neck should be. The kind that skitters out the front door of its house, supported on a wave of human feet, pattering along like oars on either side of a fleshy paddle-like tail, offering a quaint, "Howdy, Frank, how's the kids?" before making its way to its day job as a customer service representative at a software engineering company, and eventually returning to its nightly hobby of invading the homes of the unsuspecting populace to ceaselessly haunt the minds of children by hiding under beds and making unsettling noises until the early morning hours, lashing the million tongues inside its chest mouth, revealing itself only when its hunger gets the best of it, driving it to force children into its chest mouth and suck upon their bodies to soften the pangs of starvation caused by leaving behind its predatory past, leaving nothing but copious saliva and deeply traumatized children in its wake. You know, the kind of monster that everybody has seen at some point. But the monster Cornelius saw there didn't harbor any normal, run-of-the-mill malice in its soul. It stored a malice that shook at the foundation of his very being, an incomparable wrongness that should reduce any earthly vessel to ash and scorched bone. Yet this thing still somehow existed in blatant defiance of everything good and decent in the world. It had been walking before, if one could call such an uncoordinated, shambling walking. The moment that it realized it had been observed, it stopped. It stared forward completely still. Very, very slowly, without moving its body, it turned its massive head. A tiny pair of beady black eyes stared at Cornelius. Its enormous maw parted subtly, leaving a tiny space between its gigantic baseball bat teeth. It darted a long, narrow tongue in the gaps between the aluminum bats. The two stared at each other for several minutes. Then, the thing suddenly turned forward again, walking along as though nothing had happened. Its huge, hairy arms swung dramatically as it walked. Its webbed baseball glove hands dragged on the asphalt as it made its way down the street on its minuscule legs. With each step, its knobby knees struck the back of its massive jaw. It awkwardly waddled off into the darkness without looking back once. Cornelius didn't sleep that night. Finally, by the sun's return, Cornelius had convinced himself to leave his barricaded bedroom. He made himself a promise to never look out any window in his house again. The monster from yesterday seemed to react the very moment Cornelius observed it. Anything that would keep that monster out of his life he would do without a second thought. He made sure to close all of the curtains and nail up some old towels over the rest of the windows. He couldn't decide whether keeping the lights off would convince the monster to pass him by or loudly announce his presence, so he decided to only turn the lights halfway, just in case. Content that he was sufficiently protected, Cornelius continued his life of mindless consumption of food and television, deciding that running amok outside in an attempt to gravely injure himself for his own entertainment was not nearly worth the risk of running into that thing. The next few days passed by without incident again, and Cornelius struggled to maintain his spirits as his supply of non-vegetable and non-sugar-free food diminished. As several more days bled by, he began to exhaust these items as well, only able to stomach such rotten foods through the extraordinary circumstances, though he would literally eat the silverware in his kitchen before chancing another encounter with the horrid thing that wandered his neighborhood. In fact, he had tried eating his silverware, but the metal was a little too hard on his sugar-rotten teeth, and he decided to steel himself for a visit to the store across the street. Money in hand, he cautiously approached the front door. For nearly 10 minutes he stood motionless, uncertain as to whether it would be preferable to open the door blind or check behind the blanket he had stapled over the window earlier and risk finding it wandering the streets again. Finally, with a trembling hand, he convinced himself to take the doorknob and gently coerce the door open. He closed his eyes in anticipation, praying that he would find the streets empty, or better yet, occupied by other people. The door opened with a subtle creak, and as the door touched the wall to the side, Cornelius stood completely still. It had been standing in the doorway, staring motionlessly straight forward for an indeterminate length of time. Its small, beady, pitch-dark eyes met Cornelius. Its high cheekbones pushed even higher when it smiled, Its tall metal teeth twitched slightly, independent from each other. A tiny baseball cap sat upon its balding head, its leathery, webbed fingers subtly grabbed at the air, hanging by its knees. Its tall torso had been stitched together from several parts in the pattern of a large baseball. Staring quietly at him, it stepped forward the very moment Cornelius stepped back. Both of them stopped. Cornelius shuddered in place, barely able to stand. He just stared forward with glistening eyes and wet cheeks. He had no idea what to do or where to go. So he moved to his aunt's house for the rest of the summer. Though Cornelius lived in a rather remote neighborhood near the edge of town, his aunt lived in a comparatively large home on a derelict farm about 7 miles outside town. Her long work hours, combined with the distant commute, meant that Cornelius had to spend most of his time alone. Though he would rather have an adult around all the time, he was at least grateful to have somebody in the house while he slept. But as a few weeks passed, his aunt suddenly found that her mother, Cornelius' grandmother, had fallen terribly ill. Cornelius gave little thought to this, as it was his least favorite grandparent that had been the one to suddenly suffer from premature diabetes of the hair, until he realized that his aunt would be away from home for the weekend to visit her. Cornelius would not allow another incident. He dismantled most of the furniture to create makeshift barricades on every window and door. Everything he could move had been placed in front of a possible point of entry and furiously nailed in place. Everything except for his bed, which he dragged down into the windowless basement. He also carried with him an ornate, antique shotgun which had been mounted over the fireplace. After dismantling the basement staircase board by board and sealing the door with a foot-thick barricade, he buried himself under several comforters in bed, cradling the shotgun in his arms. Slowly, he began to drift off. He suddenly found himself awake in the middle of the night. Not awoken by a noise or light, but simply brought back to a state of awareness. He had thrown his comforters towards his feet in the middle of the night, and he rolled onto his back, trying to keep his eyes closed and roll back into a deep slumber. However, when he realized he was no longer holding his shotgun, he hesitated, then snapped his eyes open. It was standing across the room. Its mouth stretched open to obscure most of its body with an enormous wall of baseball bats, except for its outstretched arms. It held the shotgun forward so Cornelius could see it, and then tipped its hands forward, dropping it on the floor. Slowly, one leg at a time, it stepped over the shotgun towards Cornelius. He sat perfectly still, staring at the thing with wide eyes. He blinked once, and it very cautiously stepped forward. He blinked again to be sure, and again it took a reserved step towards him. He stared without blinking for as long as he could. Blink, step. Blink, step. Blink, step. Blink, step. The thing had reached its bed. It planted both hands firmly on the mattress and slowly clambered up onto the bed, pinning Cornelius to the sheets. It moved very close to him and put its head beside his. In a low, harsh whisper, it nearly silently spoke. 3 strikes, you're out. So that's the baseball player, which, the long, meandering asides in there is pretty typical for the book plot twist that this comes from. We do that a lot. So the full context of this scene is that in the only bit of continuity in the story, for the most part, there are several chapters that take place back to back when the characters are stranded inside a haunted hotel and they start telling stories from when they were kids. And the character Cornelius tells this story as an adult already, like, having apparently somehow gotten out of this. He's telling this like it's a story from his childhood, and it becomes apparent that he's not lying when the baseball player appears, like, walking through the woods in the background of one scene. He's like, they're stopped at a stoplight out on a country road in the middle of the night, and he looks out the window and sees it peeking from behind a shrub or something like that. So apparently this is an actual thing. It crawls up onto the bed, whispers 3 strikes, you're out, and then just leaves, and that's the last he sees of it until he's an adult. Apparently, because I don't know. I honestly don't know why.
It doesn't murder. It doesn't eat people. It doesn't kill them, apparently, or not him. But it does enjoy scarring people and toying with them.
And again, part of the thing that makes this as spooky as it is that it is clearly able to get into his head and is able to speak. So that that sort of enhances the spooks a little bit. But then also this thing is also apparently a predatory thing, because there's like a scene where it picks up a deer and just puts it in its mouth, and then the bat
beats it to death with its teeth, since they're all baseball bats and can move independently. It just bludgeons a deer to death in its maw.
So that's like, yeah, it's not even like, oh, it's a peaceful thing, it eats fruit or something. Nope. This thing is apparently a predator, and
it eats meat. Big meat. Whole. Live.
So it very, very easily could have just fucking
picked up a young boy and done the same.
But nope, it crawls up onto his bed and scares the hell out of him, and then just like gets up and walks out of the windowless basement with the door barricaded shut 10 feet off the ground.
With the stairs dismantled.
Yep.
Also, it got in there like that somehow.
Yep. Because again, that's sort of the style of plot twist. You can see it earlier too, because there was a scene where I stopped when I was reading it for a second and just kept saying the words. I'm like, okay, so when he sees it the first time and gets a good look at it, it's in the middle of the day and it's just walking down the street, and then at the end it walks off into the darkness, like it's apparently nighttime now, even though it also specifies only a couple of minutes have passed. So it found some darkness to wander off into in the middle of the day.
Either that or it created some. Just with its presence.
Mm-hmm.